It's the Legends Lounge here at the U.S. Ski and Snowboard Hall of Fame. Hi, everybody. I'm your host, Dan Egan, and so fired up about this video series where we get to interview the top influencers in the world of winter sports on behalf of the U.S. Ski and Snowboard Hall of Fame. And today is no different. We get to honor Howard Peterson, one of the people who built the sport from the USSA and FIS and really united what we know today as the U.S. ski team and USSA. And without these mentors and leaders and influencers, our industry at times would be completely lost. It's the individuals that had the foresight and the courage to lead the industry to get us to where we are now. And as always, we're going to check in with Justin, the executive director of the U.S. Ski and Snowboard Hall of Fame. Justin, how are you?
Dan, good. How about you today?
Good. We're rolling through this video series, the Legends Lounge, and it's so funny because it's so diverse. The different types of people that are in the U.S. Ski and Snowboard Hall of Fame, and today's no different. We have Howard Peterson, who really made a difference with USSA and eventually U.S. Ski Team, and really behind the Olympics, bringing them to Salt Lake. You just must be amazed every day that you go to work at the diversity of the people in the hall.
Yeah, the diversity across all the different aspects of the sport, but also the history and the tightness and how small the industry really is with these kingpin or key players. Today we're going to have the opportunity of getting a first person perspective from another Hall of Famer. So we've got two of you guys on today. You, of course, hosting, Dan, and then Tom Kelly, who I'm sure you'll introduce shortly. But no better person to really tell these stories and really show our audience how tight knit people are that have really shaped this industry. So always a pleasure and honored to come to work, learn about these people, and really keep the history alive. This one's especially exciting and different than past Legends Lounge episodes that we've done, Dan, because I think we're going to learn a lot of behind the scenes history related things that most people don't think of when they see a racer come out of the starting gates in a couple of years in our next Olympics, or watch reruns from the 2002 Olympics in Salt Lake City. There's people behind this stuff, and we have the honor of telling those stories and keeping that history alive here in Ishpeming.
Absolutely. And the stories echo throughout the Hall of Fame. And as Justin alluded to, we're joined by another than Tom Kelly. Tom, how are you?
I'm doing great, Dan. Justin, good to see you. Justin is sitting there in one of my very favorite rooms in the Hall of Fame in Ishpeming, Michigan. Library, lots of history there behind him.
Lots of history and history that well, Tom. I know that in my own career, you're somebody I've looked up to throughout the years and still continue to do with your vast knowledge of the industry and people like Howard Peterson. Just give us a synopsis of Howard's career and how it came to be that you two intersected.
Well, Howard's an amazing individual and really one of those unheralded behind the scenes figures that had made such a difference in our sport over the last 20 or 30 years. Howard was actually the person who hired me to work at then U.S. Ski Association. That was back in 1986. But we had met on a summer day in July in, let's see, it would have probably been 1978 in northern Wisconsin. I was working for the Telemark ski area. It was Howard Peterson's very first day as the marketing director for USSA, and he and a colleague had come to northern Wisconsin to talk to my boss, Hall of Famer Tony Wise, about getting the American Birkebeiner race into the Great American Ski Chase. It wasn't a very successful meeting that first day as Tony turned them down, but later Howard was able to complete the negotiation and get the Berkey into the Great American Ski Chase. But he and I met that day and we became friends for many years. And then about 7 years or so later, he hired me to work as the assistant national Nordic director at USSA. And I was alongside him for many, many years, working with him either as an employee or as a confidant or someone who just admired what he did and what he brought to the sport through his leadership and most notably the vision that he had for our sport.
You know, in the world of the internet and all the conveniences we have today, sometimes it's hard to remember just how important these organizations were, USSA, as far as keeping the interest for recreational skiers active and participating, and all of the benefits that came along with joining USSA. Can you just kind of bring us back in time and paint a picture of what USSA was then?
Yeah, it was interesting. And Howard came along at a really pivotal time. When he started, he worked in the Brattleboro, Vermont office of USSA back in the late 70s. And USSA had established a marketing arm at that point. The U.S. ski team was a separate organization at the time. It had broken away some years earlier to form the U.S. Ski Educational Foundation. And that was the entity that supported the teams in cross country, ski jumping, Nordic combined, and alpine. And Howard came along in this marketing role, and he had already had a background in the sport. He was one of the founders of the National Ski Touring Operators Association, now the Cross Country Ski Areas Association, and he was starting to become a little bit of a notable leader in the sport. He came from Maine. He was a climber and an outdoorsman. But USA at the time was an organization very much in need of direction. It had become more a recreational entity than a competitive entity. And this is kind of a bit of a crazy story, but there was a time where airfares in this country were regulated, and the only way you could really get discounted airfares were if you were an affinity group. So there were many organizations that created these affinity groups, and that's what USSA was in for a period of time in the 1970s and in the 1980s. It had become very recreationally oriented. He wanted to really change that. First of all, airlines had been regulated. That factor was no longer in play. He wanted to get back to the competitive roots of the organization. And that's really what he built during the 1980s with USSA, getting back to focus on the rules, the races, and the calendars of the competitive sports of skiing. The USSA was also the representative of the sport to the U.S. Olympic Committee and also to the International Ski Federation. So we really put everything in order during that period of time. And in addition to that, really was the catalyst for starting what became the U.S. Adaptive Ski Team, as well as the U.S. Freestyle Ski Team, and very, very much involved in getting freestyle into the Olympics.
Of course, we're on the Legends Lounge here at the U.S. Ski and Snowboard Hall of Fame. We're talking about recently elected to the U.S. Ski and Snowboard Hall of Fame, Howard Peterson, who led the USSA and eventually was able to create what we know today as the Association of USSA and U.S. Ski Team. But as Tom, as you're describing, I mean, me and countless other young ski racers relied on USSA for our schedules and for the events and for the rules and the organization that came with that. And, like I said, it's sometimes easy to forget what an impact that has had on countless individuals and their love for the sport of skiing.
Governance and rulemaking and all that, it is not sexy. It's not really inherently interesting, but it's essential. It's essential that you have that good basis. You don't have that. You have no order. You have chaos, more or less. Interesting side story. In the late 80s, probably around 1989, the parents of snowboarders in New England came to Howard and came to USSA and said, listen, we need help. We've got this fledgling new sport. We just don't have the rules or the understanding of how to structure it. So Howard, together with the Eastern Division of USSA, put together a program for snowboarding, and that was essentially how USSA got involved in snowboarding. It was at the request of the athletes and the parents, because they knew how foundational those rules, the regulations, the scoring, the calendaring, how essential that was to run successful programs for their kids.
Of course, when we talk about people who had an influence and built the industry, Howard Peterson is one of those. And that's a great example about how snowboarding comes into the fold and look at the impact it's had today. Now, of course, Howard was also an advocate of bringing the Olympics to the United States. And you have some perspective on this, Tom, that I think goes beyond of where it landed in Salt Lake City.
Yeah, history tells us that the 2002 Olympics in Salt Lake City were a huge success, not just for Salt Lake City and the state of Utah, but for sport in America. It really was an amazing Olympic Games. If you go back to the core of how did it end up there, the key city in the United States bidding for the Olympics in the lead up to that period was Anchorage, Alaska. And Anchorage would have been a good Olympic site. But in the late 80s, Howard, who was always on the lookout for the athletes, he said, we should pick an American city that's willing to give back long term to athletes. If you just look at the days of the games, that's just this small little thing. We need to look at longevity and creating a place where in perpetuity athletes can train, kids can get involved in sport. So he was preaching this mantra to the US Olympic Committee in the late 80s. He wasn't supporting Salt Lake City specifically, he was supporting this concept. Anchorage never really bought into that concept. Reno Tahoe was one of the first to do so. And there was a period of time where we thought, well, maybe that's where this thing is going to go. But eventually, Salt Lake City figured out how important this was, started to make a commitment to that in its bid documents. And when Salt Lake City was given the US right to bid, and this was in June of 1989 at a meeting in Des Moines, Iowa, Salt Lake City won by a mere 2 votes, just 2 votes to get that US nod. And I really attribute that to the efforts that Howard Peterson made in pushing this concept of legacy. And now we sit here 2 decades later. Every single one of those venues is in current use. Kids are on those venues all the time. The venues have been updated and modernized, and it created a legacy like not even Howard Peterson had envisioned. It was extremely successful.
Absolutely. And to look at those venues today and to see the legacy left behind by the 2002 games, it's really amazing. Justin, when you see the impact that somebody like Howard Peterson has on the industry, and you think about the different people and influencers who have built our industry that are residing up there in the Hall of Fame, as I say, these stories continue to echo around the museum.
They do, again, and all interconnected. I learning something from Tom right now, and thinking about my annual trip to Park City and seeing these venues and seeing, I mean, to think about the forethought or foresight to focus on that legacy is incredible. These people are legends within the industry, and legends themselves individually. So it's great, Dan.
Sometimes we take for granted because it's easy to be wrapped up into the politics of things. But when you see what Howard Peterson was able to build, we have a very stable sports federation in the winter sports with USSA and USS Ski Team. And that stability really has created so much success within itself. That's its own legacy. But can you just talk to Howard's impact on creating a stable association?
Yeah, he really focused on fundamentals. And I appreciate you bringing up this point because this was a long time ago and people don't naturally draw that connection. But if you look at the history of the organization, and certainly like any, it's had its ups and downs. But the core principles that are in place today really were those that Howard put in place in the late 80s and in the early 90s. You can also only imagine the challenge in bringing together these two disparate organizations, the U.S. Ski Team and the U.S. Ski Association, each one of which had a large board, and they had to be brought together to create this even larger board. And fortunately, a few years later, there was an opportunity through the U.S. Olympic Committee to rewrite the bylaws and shrink that board down to a more manageable size. But Howard was the ultimate tactician and politician in bringing this together and making sure that all entities felt that they were addressed in this. Let's also think about something that's truly unique across all of the 50 plus sports organizations in America. There's no other entity that has so many different, distinctly defined sports as skiing does. There's alpine skiing, cross country skiing, ski jumping, Nordic combined. Those were all already in existence. Now freestyle was coming into vogue in the 80s. And then in the 90s, it was snowboarding. So the organization is growing in size, stature, and diversity. And he had to bring all of these pieces together, get everybody to coexist. And at the same time, get them to work together for the common good. And this really manifested itself in some of the international legislation that the organization was able to push by bringing all of these entities together. And all of a sudden, the US started to become a force internationally because he had trained and messaged and educated each of these US representatives in each of the sports to go into their committees and push for the common good. And one great example of this was Howard was singularly responsible for getting cash prizes into the sport. Cash prizes became legal by the IOC in the late 80s, but no sport really was touching it. Skiing was the first one to do that in 1990, and that was all at Howard Peterson's lead.
That's amazing to think about. And, again, it's Howard Peterson's foresight and vision to create this stable opportunity, but it goes beyond the borders of the U.S., right? You mentioned the USOC, and then, of course, internationally into integrating with FIS to really impact the benefit of athletes to professionalize and make a living and careers, and how many have been impacted. It's amazing. But when you take this stable organization and then bring it onto the international stage via FIS, that's a real advantage that he was able to create.
Yeah, and he really knew how to play that game. He became very close to then FIS president Mark Hodler, became very involved in the push for snowboarding. Howard had left USSA by the time that snowboarding actually got in, but he was really one that laid the groundwork with Mark Hodler. Mark Hodler had, I believe it was a grandson who was involved in the sport. So Howard took advantage of that and really lobbied Mark Hodler to push this with the IOC and to try to get it in. And ultimately it was put in for the 1998 list for the first. So he figured out how to really influence and did it very tactfully. And, he was never an out person himself, but he got stuff behind the scenes.
Tom, it's amazing to me, to talk about these sorts of accomplishments, but when it really comes down to leadership style, right? It really comes down to being effective. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how Howard as a person and what he brought to it with his personality was able to pull all of this off.
He was a unique personality, and he and his late wife, Susan, were really the faces behind the scene of the sport. Howard has a background as a climber. He's written a number of books on climbing. He has pioneered several first ascents around the country. So he had a very tactfully thinking mind, and he went about everything very, very methodically. He was not necessarily a very outgoing person. He was somewhat quiet. His network of friends was not that large, but those who he was close to were very devoted to him because they knew he stood for really good values, and he was someone who was worth investing time and work in because you knew you were going to go somewhere. And that was my take on him. Is what really attracted me to him was he was taking us places we had never been before. I worked for this guy Tony Wise at Telemark, who is in the Hall of Fame, and Tony had a number of those characteristics as well. He was able to really think forward into a vision, but then to be able to think tactically as to how to get there. And that's what Howard did. And it's what really attracted me in working with him for the years that I did. And even after he left USSA, we stayed very close over time. And it's kind of funny. Here's an example of how Howard knew how to get things done. Howard had this philosophy that the single most important person in any meeting was the secretary, because that person took the minutes of the meeting. And after every meeting that Howard chaired, I think in his entire career, he would sit down with me and we would mutually craft the minutes of the meeting so that they accurately reflected what we wanted them to reflect. We didn't change anything, but we made sure that the nuances in the minutes reflected the decision making that we wanted to see. And it was just masterful thinking like that as to how to manage a meeting, how to manage individuals. He would go into meetings and he was kind of quiet as the chair, and you weren't really sure he was really connected. But then all of a sudden you realize the people he's calling on in the meeting and the questions that he's asking, they're leading to a very well defined outcome. And he was a master at this.
That's I love to hear that when leaders have that deep of strategy and thought into what they're trying to achieve. And of course, when people sign up for a USSA race, any level, snowboard, free ride, ski, moguls, Nordic, you're really benefiting from this thing that is a very large and stable and successful organization, which people like Howard Peterson help lead and guide and create for so many skiers and riders today. Tom, when you think about that impact all the way down into the towns and the ski towns around the country, is it hard for you sometimes to really see it get down to that level, or is it so obvious to you that people are benefiting from what it was created?
Well, Dan, it's obvious to me, but then I'm really I think the expert sees that, and that's why I think someone like Howard Peterson as the new inductee into the U.S. Ski and Snowboard Hall of Fame is so important because it brings out those individuals who made that kind of a difference. I have been over a career. I mean, I love working with the Taylor Shiffrins and the Lindsey Vonn and the Bode Millers and the Johnny Mosleys and all others. But at the end of the day, people who are the real unsung heroes are the volunteers, or the people like Howard Peterson who are getting things done behind the scenes and making it possible. And that's why I think this selection of Howard Peterson is so vital, because it really speaks to people who make the sport happen and provide the opportunities for athletes like Tommy Moe and Bode Miller and Michaela Schifrin. If it wasn't for people like Howard Peterson, we wouldn't have that platform.
You know, I've seen some great pictures with Howard and the athletes over the years, where they're all smiles with success on the international and national stage. And Justin, when you see that, you really see what sport's all about. It's a lot of people, a lot of moving parts, all with the same vision in mind, the same end goal, to really enjoy the winter and enjoy winter sports.
Yeah, and if you look at, supporting, letters for nominations for people like Tom Kelly or people like Howard Peterson, you always see those athletes that Tom mentioned. You always see, a letter from Tamara McKinney or a letter from, some of those high echelon athletes that really looked up to these people. They fully understood, in my experience in talking with them and having conversations, fully understood and respected all the work that went into getting them to the starting gate or getting them to the international competitions and things of that nature. So it's really cool to see, Dan, from the Hall of Fame standpoint, to see that interconnectivity and that mutual respect for fellow Hall of Famers and people that they either stood on their shoulders or they'll be the one providing the shoulder in the future.
Absolutely. And in this series on the Legends Lounge, we've heard about all different types of skiers that have influenced the sport, and some who got into the industry, like Jim Newhouse, who really wasn't a skier and then now calls himself an intermediate skier. And then somebody like Howard Peterson, who, Tom, was a climber and had the passion for the outdoors from the beginning. And do you think that was sort of what the driver was for him, was that passion?
Passion for the outdoors. I mean, he did grow up a climber, but he was also a cross country skier, and he ended up with a job at Bretton Woods in the Mount Washington area of New Hampshire, and that really started off his career. And he kept that passion for cross country skiing through his entire life. After he left USSA, following the 1994 Olympics in Lillehammer, he got involved with the 2002 Olympics and ultimately found his home at Soldier Hollow. He had been instrumental in helping to develop the concept for what Soldier Hollow would be with the Olympics, and ended up spending the rest of his career there and making a real difference on a venue that was an international race venue. But really what he gave back there was to the local community. And it's amazing to go there today. Every day in the winter, hundreds and hundreds of kids out there on cross country skis, all introduced because of the concept that Howard Peterson brought to that valley.
Very relevant this winter with all of the growth going on with Nordic skiing and so many people getting back into Nordic skiing. And it's going to be out there in the woods on the tracks and really getting fit and enjoying the great outdoors. Here on the Legend Lounge at U.S. Ski and Snowboard Hall of Fame, it's one more example of one person, one passion making a big difference. Tom, thank you for your insight and knowledge and help with this.
Well, it's been fun. This is a great concept to talk about these legends in this way. And Howard Peterson was a great friend and a great contributor to the sport, and proud to see that he will be recognized in the U.S. Ski and Snowboard Hall of Fame.
And of course, Justin, we can't wait to do it in person.
Absolutely.
Hey, this has been another great and fun episode of the Legends Lounge here at U.S. Ski and Snowboard Hall of Fame. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.